Welcome to Global Money Talk, brought to you by SamProTV. Greetings to all of our viewers from across the U.S., Korea, and around the world. We're coming to you live from the floor of the New York Stock Exchange in New York City, the financial capital of America. I'm Remy Blur, and joining me today for our market briefing and to weigh in on the top stories of the day is Tai Wong, independent proprietary trader. Tai, happy Monday to you.
Happy Monday. Great to be here. It's almost like going to be a summer day today.
I know here in New York City, we're expecting a high of 79 degrees, unseasonably warm for this time of year.
Certainly. We're only a couple of weeks away from November.
And I understand today there is a focus on Apple.
Yes, it's National Apple Day. Not the phone, actually the fruit that you eat. And what I'm really amazed is I love apples, but when I was growing up, it was just the red delicious apple. Now you have all these things, the Fuji apple, which is great, amazing, like wow, it's always good. And then the Honeycrisp came over and like ate everybody's lunch. So National Apple Day, great day. Have a little bit of cider, and also today happens to be Trafalgar Day, if you're a historian, the Great Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, where Horatio Nelson, who led the British fleet, beat the French and Spanish fleets. And then also, for an actress of my generation, it's Carrie Fisher's birthday, Princess Leia.
Oh, happy birthday.
Yes.
Well, as we kick off the new trading week, we're keeping an eye on a lot of stories, but why don't we start out with a look at the major U.S. stock averages, because we've been seeing a lower open followed by mixed trading, and here we are, we're seeing the Dow Jones Industrial Average off by over 100 points, 200 points actually, and down by 0.6%. Meanwhile, the NASDAQ Composite is also lower on the session, off by about a quarter of a percentage point, and the S&P 500 is now lower by 0.4%, or about 25 points. But there's a lot going on today, and when we look across the markets, we're seeing the 10-year yield for U.S. Treasuries above 4.1 this morning. We're seeing crude oil higher as well, and gold new record highs. So
again.
Yes, indeed.
I'm not long enough.
Yeah, so why don't we start out with a look at what's going on in terms of the market, especially given that we saw record highs last week.
So one of the things I've noticed, and as we talk in the morning early in the session, sometimes the averages are down, but they seem to creep back up to be even or even a little positive by the end of the day. I think part of that is the dynamic that there is so much money coming in on a daily basis that goes into the market, in terms of people buying the S&P 500 index, or putting in the various number of the many ETFs, which are well over $10 trillion of U.S. held ETFs, that eventually they're just buying every day, and if there's not any selling to counter, we end up finishing higher. So that's really been a pattern, that I think it feels like it happens almost every day. In terms of, you mentioned crude. Now, crude had a big correction, over the last couple of weeks, as the feared Israeli retaliation against Iran seems to have not yet materialized. There's a lot of talk about it, a lot of conjecture, and I think part of the reason why it's up today, crude is up today, is because Israel has hit more targets in Lebanon. They're going after a bank or a financial institution that's apparently an arm of Hezbollah. They also, early in the weekend, they sent drones, and one of their drones appears or apparently was targeted near Prime Minister Netanyahu's second home. Yes. And if there's a good way not to have peace talks, is to shoot a missile at the Prime Minister's second home. Nobody was injured. I don't know if it was intercepted or if it was even a mistake, but nevertheless, I think it's going to be tough to really have peace in that region. There's been no sort of overtures of, we'll release the hostages and let's stop this. I guess the view, from Hamas leadership is it the same as the poor suffering civilians, where if they have peace, they'll have to rebuild and you'll have to govern. And that might be a little harder than just fighting from tunnels and launching missiles. I think this, as much as the Biden administration would love to see at least a truce before the election, I'm not sure that's going to happen.
And Tai, you and I, we've been monitoring the situation in the Middle East, and we've been keeping an eye on oil prices, both crude, WTI, as well as Brent. And we've been seeing a lot of volatility when it comes to oil prices. And as you mentioned, a lot of factors that are affecting the price action for that. Of course, we'll keep you updated on what happens in the Middle East and if there is any progress there. But as we head into the rest of this week, we do get a slew of earnings. So we saw volatility last week in terms of the key names ASML, Taiwan Semiconductor, and this week we get earnings from Tesla, and other names reporting include IBM as well as Coca-Cola, Texas Instruments. We'll keep an eye on what happens in semiconductors. But what are you focused on as we head into the new week?
I think Tesla is going to be at the top of everybody's sort of list of things to watch out for on Wednesday. To see, I think people expect their profit margins to have increased, but we're not so sure about the rest of the report. And I think the stock's down maybe 8% since the robo-taxi reveal, which didn't give people as many sort of details as they wanted. I was really particularly interested that Uber rallied like 10% right after that as Tesla fell, because they thought, oh, phew, the moat around our taxis is still pretty wide. Some other things that I'm keeping an eye on rather, is Verizon. Comcast is also out to see how the telecommunications folks are doing. And it's going to give I think one of the reasons why the market's sort of maybe a little listless this Monday morning is there's really not that much to trade off of right now. We did have, by the way, the Chinese banks over the weekend did cut their prime rates. And they cut it 25 basis points for 1 year and 5 year, which was a little bit more than expected. But the Chinese stock market was really not that impressed. One of the benchmarks was up, the other benchmark was sort of flat on the day. And it goes back to the question of, if you don't see great opportunity, and if your balance sheet is in trouble in terms of if you're a local government or if you're a company and you've borrowed a lot of money and the economic outlook is poor, more money, you don't really want to borrow. And some people call that a balance sheet recession, where even if you pour money in, if you give it to the private sector, you give it to the banks or the governments, they say, well, we're going to take this money and improve our balance sheets. And if you do that, you actually don't stimulate the economy like the Chinese government sort of wants to. So ultimately, I think they will have to directly stimulate the economy, and you get the sense that they're watching pretty carefully whether or not they're convinced that this is what they have to do. Well, we'll find out in the next weeks to months. But as of right now, the exuberance that came with that huge stock market rally has kind of waned. People don't want to sell, so they're fear of missing out on a big rally. But right now, there's not a lot of impetus there as well.
Yeah, it does appear as though there is somewhat of a muted reaction to this. And as you mentioned, after we got the additional measures by China, we're not seeing that much of a gain in the equity markets overseas.
We're definitely not. So this is, and you could see the authorities in China crying, well, we've given so many things. What do we have to do? I think we went over on the show last week what they have to do. You could rather fix that property market, fix the population, and change the mindset of the market and the people. And I think they haven't done that yet. I'm not sure they're ready to do that, because there's some pretty big steps.
And Tai, as you mentioned, it's easier to say than actually do.
Oh, absolutely.
So
absolutely.
We'll keep you updated on what happens there. But before we move away from earnings, since we started out the show talking about it, I do want to shift our focus on over to Boeing. So in New York morning trade, shares of Boeing are still in positive territory. We earlier saw Boeing shares up by as much as 4%. Right now, they're up by 3%. So Wednesday is going to be a very busy day for Boeing. So not only do they have earnings, but at the same time, workers are scheduled to vote on whether to accept a tentative deal with the union to end their strike, which is going into week 5 now.
That's right. That's right. So with a nudge from the government, I think the union and the and Boeing have agreed to a 4-year, 35% pay hike, plus a big one-time payout, a 12% contribution to the 401k, which is pretty darn good. I've never had 4% contribution in the 401k. And for our readers, for our viewers, if you match whatever the company gives you. If the company gives you 12% and they'll match, you want to do the maximum match because that money grows over time. That's really, really powerful. If you do that for 10 or 15 years, you'll take a look. Wow, my 401k looks pretty good. If you've kept it in, say, the S&P 500. But back to Boeing for a second. When they initially, before the strike, they initially said 4 years, 25%. The union was sort of in favor of it. And it got overwhelmingly rejected, 95%. And this time, the unions sort of agreed to it, and it's a pretty good deal. Essentially, they've gotten almost everything they wanted. I mean, originally they wanted 4 years, 40%. 4 years, 35%, plus a bunch of other kickers is actually pretty close to what they, what they were asking for initially. But they're not getting. One thing they really did want back was the defined benefit pension. I just don't see that happening. That's just too much of a lift for any industrial company, because you're saying, if you retire at 55 or 60 or whatever it might be, and you live for 30, 40 years, I'm going to have to pay you a big chunk every month, equivalent to a substantial fraction of your salary. You can really only get that from the government these days. But interestingly, the union has not been rah rah rah. We've got a great deal, because maybe they're a little bit chastened and they don't want to leave themselves out there. It is uncertain whether or not they are going to approve it. One of the analysts I was reading just before the show, one of the analysts who covers Boeing, said he's been scouring Boeing employee Reddits, and he says that they feel like it feels like it's 75% against, 25% for, but he said these people were really the loud ones who didn't want the original agreement, so there's probably some sort of skew there. But it looks like it might be a very, very close sort of vote. And it's the same day that Boeing comes out with earnings. We know earnings is going to be sort of dreadful. I mean, if I were Kelly Ortberg, I get all the bad news out right now. Write-downs, whatever you want, because you can blame it on the previous guy, and if you can get this strike resolved, I mean, $100 million, $150 million a day in revenue that gets pushed off later, you're going to look really, really good, and you would expect a pretty decent rally in Boeing. I think if he writes down as many things as he can, and they get the strike over with. But the other thing, though, is it's going to take them some time to really spin up all the manufacturing back again. Maybe get the suppliers who may have laid off people, who maybe have increased jobless claims, to everybody to come back to work. So it will be weeks, if not months, before they really get that assembly line back going. But the market will be really happy to see that, if it happens.
Yeah, I think you highlighted a lot of important points when it comes to Boeing, because with each passing day that goes by for the strike, there's so many implications here, right? We're talking about labor, suppliers, and the bottom line for the company as well. And with new leadership coming in, perhaps if he is watching this, I think he should take your advice when it comes to just getting all of the bad news out there.
That's right, absolutely.
Yeah, because we're talking about how strikes affect the economic data here in the U.S. when it comes to the labor market. And when the port strike first happened between the labor organization and the Gulf, the closure of the East Coast ports and the Gulf Coast ports, we knew how it was going to impact the economy if it had lasted longer. And thank God it ended after 3 days. So
right. That was a very pleasant surprise. Hopefully we get a pleasant surprise here. And I think with the holidays coming out, if you're on strike, you're thinking, I'm getting some strike pay. But if I ask for 40% and they're giving 35 plus, a lot of other nice contributions, let's just take it and move along, and move on. I mean, at the end of the day, it's a pretty good job. I mean, I think the average machinist there probably makes over $110,000 a year. With the new deal, by the time it's done, it'll be $140,000 for the machinists who've been on there. It's pretty good pay, and going into the holidays, you don't need that uncertainty.
And speaking of heading into the holiday season, we'll be paying attention to economic data, obviously on labor, whether it's jobless claims or the big U.S. jobs report, which is coming out on November 1st. And that does remind me that we have a lot that is coming down the pike when it comes to economic data. So we have that jobs report, and of course the election here in the U.S. 15 days away, Tai. Hard to believe.
The election, I mean, a lot of stuff over the weekend that was pretty interesting. The first one was Donald Trump, and I'm going to have to say, this was brilliant. He did a short shift, I guess, in Pennsylvania, where he did French fries. He gave the bags out to the customers. Apparently there were 1,000 people lined up, hoping to be able to just see the former president and have him hand out fries. And there are pictures all over him, like salting the fries and putting them in the container. He goes, "I didn't touch a single fry." And everybody remember how much of a germaphobe he is, and he loves McDonald's. So I mean, I just, for someone like that who's a billionaire who lives in Mar-a-Lago, to be able to come out and say, I'm at McDonald's. It really makes him very, very relatable. He's always loved McDonald's. In fact, one year he bought McDonald's during the pandemic. He bought McDonald's for a football team that had won the national championship. The chefs were on furlough. He said he just bought $1,000 worth of McDonald's. So that worked out. That was really one of the best sort of public relations ideas I think I've seen in a very, very long time. And one more point on the elections, and this is a little more controversial, is Elon Musk has come out and said, if you are in one of the 7 swing states and you're a registered voter and you've signed my petition, I will give out $1 million a day to one person, I guess chosen at random. And he did that twice over the weekend to howls of protest. Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro, who many think should have been Vice President Harris's running mate, came out and said, "I'm not sure this is legal." It probably skirts the line a little bit, but he says, "Sign my petition. I'm the world's richest man. I'm $1 million, to basically drive up the vote and drive up the interest." Maybe money actually well spent. Is he getting more press doing this, or is he getting more press buying ads? So really, coming down the home stretch, it's going to be really a fascinating election. My thinking and my fear is that we don't find out on election night or the morning after, and we have to wait days or weeks. It's not going to be good for the Republic and not going to be good for the markets.
Yeah, you bring up a lot of key points there when it comes to what we saw out of Donald Trump this weekend and from Elon Musk, and hopefully we do get results sooner than later when it comes to the U.S. presidential election, because we have to keep in mind that not only do we have that election day here in the U.S., but that will be followed by the Fed Reserve meeting, which they moved because of the election. So Tuesday we get the election, Wednesday we have the 2-day Fed meeting with the November rate decision expected on the 7th of November. And very quickly, while you were talking about Elon Musk, I was just wondering how much his net worth is, and he is a multi-billionaire. So in the grand scheme of things, $1 million for him is the equivalent of how much for the average American? Wow,
and I'd have to, I think he's, depending on what Tesla stock is, I gotta think the guy's worth, $250 billion or so. So, for him, I need my HP12C to not get the zeros all wrong. But $1 million. So, that is $1 billion would be not even 0.5%. So, divide that by 1,000. It's probably like $50 to $100 for the average, for the average American, possibly even less. I do want to, calculate that, but for him, it's just, and I think he's put $75 million, or he said he'd spend $75 million on the campaign. And if you think about it, it's outlandish. It's sort of very Musk, but it might be actually quite effective, because you buy ads, and who watches network television? How do you know if Facebook is putting your ads in the right place? This is getting him a lot of press and a lot of howls of protest. So, actually, I think a brilliant ploy at the end of the day for a man who says, he really thinks that, and he runs X, formerly known as Twitter. He thinks that this is a really important election. He's putting his money where his mouth is.
Yes, absolutely. And if you think about it, we're here talking about it too.
That's right.
So yeah, he is getting a lot of coverage. But before we move on, I do very quickly want to switch our focus to Cuba.
Oh, yes.
So at the end of last week, they lost power, and just to make things worse, they are facing the aftermath of a hurricane as well.
That's right. Hurricane Oscar, I think might have left the island early this morning, but ran through the island. They had lost power before, so nobody knows how Cuba is doing because they're incommunicado. So what's tough about Cuba is almost all their oil almost all their power is driven by burning oil, and they've gotten their oil from Russia and from Mexico and from Venezuela. Russia's had their own problems. Venezuela's had their own problems. Cuba's had kind of a cash crunch, so they can't afford to play Mexico. So their oil, their oil supplies have been down, and they're having trouble with everything, but with their power grid. And you wonder, and I actually don't think it's going to happen, that if you lose power, you've got a terrible hurricane that does a lot of damage. If that causes the lights a fire in terms of getting a regime change. I think that's unlikely to happen because of how tightly they've controlled Cuba, over the years, the Castro government and their successors. But it does remind me that in 1970, and I read this remarkable book called Vortex, there's a huge cyclone called Bola, I believe, and it killed 300,000 people and actually triggered the events that led to the creation of the country of Bangladesh from what was originally Pakistan. It was East and West Pakistan, and because so many people died, and that storm really created a country. I don't think it's going to happen here, but that was a really interesting book, and how sometimes natural disasters can have really big unforeseen circumstances.
And when we think about Cuba, you might think about their vehicles, their retro vehicles, but when it comes to infrastructure, we don't want anything to be retro in this modern day and age. So in terms of Cuba's power structure, in terms of the electrical grid, what do you think will need to happen to bring it up to upgrade it at this point?
At this point, in truth, I think you need a new government to come to power and say, you know what, Cubans have suffered long enough, and the way to really upgrade the infrastructure and things that haven't been invested in, because what does Cuba do? What do they export? Cigars and people. I mean, Cubans are hardworking, legendarily, sort of literate people, and they're exported to all different, sort of allies of Cuba over the world. But you're not creating anything. And I will tell you, I think someday, if hopefully we're alive to see it. If Cuba becomes sort of open and democratic, that country is going to have a massive investment boom. But I think that's what it will take, because right now the people holding on to power are afraid to really open up the economy, open up parts of the country, because that might weaken their hold on power. So sadly, I think for the average Cuban, life is probably not going to improve in the short to medium term.
Yeah, and Tai, I was just curious about this. So apparently, according to national statistics based on Cuba, the nation said that over 10% of the nation's population left the country, which is the equivalent of 1 million people between 2022 to 2023. So I think that is significant.
It's a lot. It's a brain drain. They've gone to Miami, they've gone to Texas. Anybody who can go will sort of go, because what's the hope in Cuba? I guess you're going to work for the government, and you get to the front of the line, for the rations. So you're losing some top talent. So it's a sad situation, but it doesn't unfortunately look like it's going to improve in the short term. That's amazing. Like 10% of people are left. That
is a lot given the size of the country and the population. But Tai, as we head into the rest of this week, we do have a handful of economic data releases as well as Fed speakers. But of course, since we're getting all the earnings reports coming out this week, what is your main focus as we head into the rest of this week?
I think earnings are just going to give the market a sense of, well-being or sort of malaise, and it may very well be like, how did Tesla do? How did some of the, the big telecoms do? How is Coca-Cola doing? But I think the focus here is people are going to be, because it's not a heavy data week, there's going to be a lot more. I think there's going to be a lot of attention actually on the election. I'm going to be watching that closely to see how that develops. And we're now, we're into the very, very end. People have started voting. You're on Twitter and you see people complain about voting irregularities, and you're like, well, when you make that accusation, just give us some concrete evidence. And we haven't seen that yet, but you just hope that it goes smoothly and we don't have the horrible recriminations that we've had the last time.
Yes, it is that time of year, and we are seeing headlines about security when it comes to polling stations as well as the actual data. So we'll keep you posted on that. Tai and I will be bringing you all of the updates this week. So as always, thank you so much, Tai, for joining me here.
Great to be here.
And coming up, I will be joined by Alex Vayner, founder and managing partner at Martingale Insights. We'll be right back. Don't go away.